They say the Imperium wastes nothing, neither flesh, nor faith, nor fear. Yet when the guns fall silent for a heartbeat and the smoke settles over a battlefield that has never truly known peace, another truth crawls out from beneath the ash. The wounded are not spared. They are claimed. Not by mercy, not by rest, but by the machinery of a galaxy that has forgotten how to stop consuming itself. In the distant thunder of macro-cannons and the blinding flare of lost-fire, a soldier's scream is only another stitch in a tapestry older than memory itself. And somewhere between the moment a warrior falls and the moment their body is carried away, a question hangs heavier than a wounded man's breath. In a realm built on sacrifice, what becomes of those who refuse to die? The worlds of the Imperium whisper their answers, some in the rasp of Medicae saw blades, some in the hymns of monks who treat agony as a sacrament, and some in the cold, indifferent rhythm of cogitators that measure survival not in heartbeats, but in usable parts. And for the wounded, whose blood sinks into the soil of 10,000 forgotten fronts, these whispers become the only road left. Before we descend into that darkness, into those triage tents and apothecarion chambers and night-soaked manufactoria where broken bodies are reforged or erased, take a breath with me. If this journey into the hidden machinery of survival and ruin draws you in, consider lending your strength. Like, share, and subscribe, so more wandering souls can follow the same path into the stories no one else dares to tell. The first thing I remember is the sound. Not the screaming, though there was plenty of that, but the dull, broken hum that rose from the ground itself, as if the soil still carried the memory of the artillery barrage. It vibrated through the plates of my armor and into my ribs, a low rhythmic pulse that felt almost like a heartbeat. Almost, because the battlefield had long since lost its pulse. Smoke drifted in soft, lazy spirals above me, shimmering with particles of promethium and pulverized ceramite. Each breath tasted like burnt metal and wet earth, thick enough to chew, heavy enough to drown in. My vision swam, blurred by the grit caked into my visor and the blood that had dried across my cheek. I tried to lift my head, and the world tilted sharply before settling again. Bodies lay in uneven rows where the bombardment had flung them, some still moving, others frighteningly still. The Aquila etched into a fallen comrade's pauldron had been scorched into anonymity, its proud wings melted into a jagged smear. I wondered if anyone would ever know his name, or mine, or whether it mattered out here, on a strip of mud that would never be important enough to mark on a chart. A shrill crack sounded overhead, a lost shot fired from a ridge we had cleared hours ago. The enemy wasn't supposed to still be there. But battles in the Imperium rarely end when they're supposed to. They end when the ground decides it has taken enough bodies. Something warm dripped down my side. I pressed a gauntlet hand against my abdomen and felt the jagged edges of torn armor. The pain came a moment later, sharp and deliberate. Not enough to kill me. Not enough to save me. Movement flickered at the edge of my vision. A shape stumbling through the smoke, too unsteady to be a foe, too uncoordinated to be a fresh casualty. A fellow guardsman, blood-soaked and glass-eyed, dragging another man by the straps of his flak vest. His breath came in wet rattles. Every few steps he paused, swayed, and forced himself onward again. There was a rhythm to it. Step, stagger, drag. Step, stagger, drag. A ritual of exhaustion. He didn't see me. Or if he did, he had already judged me as someone beyond his ability to help. For a moment, I felt a hollow ache, not of injury but of understanding. On this field, compassion had weight, and most of us were too weak to carry it. A low roar rolled in from the north. Engines, multiple, heavy, disciplined. Not enemy armor. These engines growled like beasts that had been chained too long, eager for release. I pushed myself up enough to see the silhouettes emerging through the haze. Medicae transports. Not salvation, just the next stage of the process. Their floodlights stabbed through the smoke, white and merciless. The beams swept across the bodies, pausing whenever they caught movement. Servitors deployed from the side hatches, their vox grills muttering clipped binary prayers as they trudged through the mire. Their metal limbs sank deep into the mud and rose again without effort, built to ignore the weight of the wounded they collected. One servitor halted beside me. Its face was a stretched parody of humanity, a pale mask anchored by brass studs. A lumen flickered behind one dead eye. A mechadendrite extended, scanning the ragged edge of my armor, analyzing torn flesh it didn't care to understand. I felt a strange swell of anger, not because it might refuse me help, but because it might decide I was worth taking. A chirurgeon stepped into view behind it, robes fluttering like torn banners. The lenses of her helm glowed a soft, clinical blue as she knelt beside me. Her voice, filtered through a vox modulator, sounded almost gentle. "Conscious?" she asked. "Yes," I managed. "Unfortunate," she murmured. Her hands moved quickly, assessing, measuring. She wasn't checking if I would live. She was calculating if I should. A distant explosion shook the ground, but she didn't flinch. "You will be moved," she said. "Whether you return depends on triage availability." Not mercy. Availability. She signaled the servitor, and cold mechanical arms slid beneath me. As I was lifted from the mud, the battlefield tilted away, shrinking beneath me like a fading memory. Bodies became shapes. Shapes became shadows. And then the fog swallowed everything again. But one thought burned through the haze, brighter than the Medicai's floodlights. If this was salvation, what waited in the places beyond the sirens? The engines roared again, carrying us toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The interior of the Medicai transport felt like a world carved out of the battlefield's corpse, sealed, humming, and filled with the metallic taste of antiseptic vapors. Dim lumen strips lined the ceiling, flickering in a rhythm that never quite settled. Shapes lay on the stretchers beside me, some breathing in shallow, broken patterns, others held together only by field dressings and hope that had already begun to thin. The air smelled of cauterized wounds, machine oil, and the faint, coppery tang of blood that no scrub solution could mask. Every bump of the vehicle jolted through my body like a reminder that the ground outside still demanded payment. I tried to lift my head, but a restraining strap tugged it back against the pad. A precaution, they called it, though no one explained whether it was for our safety or theirs. The servitor that had lifted me now stood locked into a charging alcove, its limbs stiff as if frozen by the command protocols that dictated its obedience. Its vox grill emitted a steady hum, almost like a chant stripped of its words. To my left, a soldier lay with half his face hidden beneath a band of stained medcloth. His uncovered eye stared blankly at the ceiling, unblinking. A soft wheeze punctuated each inhale. He clutched something against his chest, a small, battered data slate. Even through the haze of pain, curiosity tugged at me. What could a dying man hold so tightly in a world that asked us to let go of everything? Before I could ask, a Medicai attendant swept past, checking vitals with short, practiced motions. Her gloves glistened with fresh antiseptic gel, but crimson stains seeped through at the fingertips. She paused over the soldier with the slate, lifted his wrist, let it drop. No words. No prayer. Just a tap on her vox bead signaling that the stretcher was ready for reassignment. His data slate slid from his fingers and clattered softly onto the deck. I closed my eyes. The transport lurched again, banking sharply. Outside, I heard the muffled thunder of distant artillery. Friendly or hostile, no one bothered clarifying. The line between the two had always been thin enough to slip beneath without noticing. "Stay awake," someone whispered. I opened my eyes to find a figure sitting on the bench across from me. A young man, though war had carved away whatever soft details he might have once had. His armor was cracked at the shoulder, his hair matted with grime. He leaned forward slightly, studying me like someone trying to decide whether a flame still breathed under the ash. "If you sleep," he said quietly, "they'll mark you as low priority." His gaze flicked to the far corner of the transport. There, beneath a flickering lumen, lay 3 bodies draped with gray cloth, still shapes on motionless stretchers. Not dead. Not alive. Waiting. I forced my breathing to steady. "Who are you?" "Trooper Jalen," he said. 113th Cadian. "You?" I told him my name. He nodded faintly, as if acknowledging something neither of us had the strength to unpack. A tremor shook his hands. "They don't mean to forget us," he said softly, staring down at his boots. "It's just, there are too many of us and not enough of them. They take who they can fix. The rest," his voice trailed off, "the rest become lessons." Before I could respond, the transport screeched to a halt. Sirens howled, long, drawn-out wails that vibrated the walls. The attendants sprang into motion. One yanked open the rear hatch, and a flood of cold night air poured in, thick with smoke and the scorched scent of ruined earth. The wounded were pulled out first, those considered stable enough to endure the rough handling. Then the critical cases. Then whatever remained. When the servitor came for me again, its grip was as cold and relentless as before. It carried me down the ramp and into a chaos of floodlights and frantic movement. I saw a hastily erected triage station ahead, canvas walls stained by shadows and lit from within by the harsh glow of portable lumens. Voices rose and fell, clipped commands mingling with cries that cut through the night like blades. As I was lowered onto a pallet, the world trembled under the roar of nearby detonations. The medici shouted orders. Attendants sprinted between stations. The air tasted sharp, like iron and ozone. A chirurgeon approached, her robe fluttering in the chemical wind. She assessed me with a single sweep of her lenses. "Category B," she said to the servitor. "Treatable with moderate expenditure. Move to the inner line." Moderate expenditure. I wasn't a man. I was a calculation. As they pushed me deeper into the triage tent, past rows of wounded who stared with hollow eyes or begged with voices already fading, a single thought threaded through my mind. Thin, fraying, but persistent. If this was only the threshold, what waited in the places beyond? The canvas walls trembled with another distant blast. And then the lights flickered. The lights steadied, but the brief darkness had carved something sharp into the atmosphere, a tension that slid between the beds like a silent predator. The inner triage line was quieter, not because the pain was less, but because the voices here were weaker. Every sound felt dampened, swallowed by the heavy canvas that sagged like tired lungs above us. The lumens overhead buzzed with an uneven pulse, casting long shadows that stretched across the wounded like accusing fingers. They placed me on a narrow cot, the frame warped from transport damage. A medici assistant appeared at my side, muttering litanies under her breath as she cut away the ruined plating over my abdomen. Cold air rushed against exposed flesh. Her fingers moved quickly, adjusting clamps, injecting coagulants, scanning with auspex that blinked in sullen red tones. She didn't speak to me, not out of cruelty, but because there was no space for conversation here. Only function. Somewhere to my right, someone whispered a prayer to the god emperor. The words faltered halfway through, swallowed by a choking sob. A chirurgeon barked an order for more analgesics. Another called for a bone saw. The metallic whine that followed cut through the tent with a clarity that made my stomach clench. Across from me, a guardsman sat upright, propped against a stack of supply crates. His leg had been amputated at the knee, the stump wrapped in a sealing bandage that pulsed with dull blue lumens. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something distant, something only he could see. A priest hovered beside him, murmuring scripture in a steady, rhythmic cadence. The guardsman didn't respond. His hands trembled in small, jerking motions, as if replaying the last seconds before the explosion that had taken his limb. A stretcher rolled past, carried by 2 attendants. The figure on it convulsed violently, froth bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Get him to the Apothecarion now," someone shouted. The attendants sprinted, boots slapping the mud. The convulsing body disappeared into the shadows beyond the tent's entrance. The Medici assistant at my side paused, her brow tightening as she checked a display on her auspex. "You're losing too much," she said, the first words she had directed toward me. "Try to stay conscious." "Trying," I muttered. Her eyes softened for a heartbeat, one of the few hints of humanity I'd seen among the frenzy, before she moved on, leaving me alone with the buzzing lumens and the distant screams. Jalen appeared a minute later, stumbling into the inner line with the assistance of a servitor that guided him like a child learning to walk. His armor had been fully cut away now, revealing the bruises that bloomed like purple storms across his ribs. When he saw me, he attempted a weak grin. "Still breathing," he rasped. "For now," I said. He let out a short, humorless laugh that dissolved into a coughing fit. The servitor steadied him until the coughing stopped. Then it turned and lumbered back toward the entrance, leaving Jalen to collapse onto the cot beside mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tent was filled with the groans of the wounded, the clipped Latin of Medici chant, and the dull thumping of distant bombardment, a reminder that the front line was not as far as we hoped. "You hear them?" Jalen asked suddenly. "Hear what?" He tilted his head toward the far end of the tent, where a canvas flap concealed the entrance to a darker chamber. "The ones they don't want us to see. Critical cases. Failed cases. Whatever they're calling them now." I listened. At first, I heard only the usual litany of suffering. But then, beneath it, almost too soft to notice, came a low moaning sound. Long drawn out. Not entirely human. "What is that?" I whispered. Jalen's gaze didn't leave the flap. "They say the Apothecarion performs rites in there. Things meant to keep soldiers alive long enough to be useful. Or long enough to die properly. Depends who you ask." His voice dropped to a hush. "Some say they're turning men into servitors in the next chamber. Right here. Right now." A chill crept through my spine. Rumors, maybe. Pain-fueled hallucinations, maybe. But this was the Imperium. Rumors often bled into reality. Before I could respond, a sharp metallic clatter echoed from the hidden chamber. The flap rustled. A silhouette moved behind it, bulky, uneven, hunched. The sound it made was a wet gurgling noise, followed by a mechanical hiss. Then silence. Every hair on my arms stood on end. Jalen swallowed. "That's not a servitor." The flap shifted again. Someone screamed. The Medici attendants dropped what they were doing. A chirurgeon reached for her weapon. Lumens flickered violently, shadows distorting across the walls of the tent like writhing serpents. The flap began to rise, and the thing behind it stepped forward. The flap lifted fully, and the light of the inner lumens revealed a form that should not have been able to move on its own. It was a man, or at least it had been. Skin torn and stitched with crude filaments of rebreather tubing, limbs reinforced with jagged metal braces, eyes glazed with an almost devotional emptiness. Its breath hissed in shallow, irregular bursts, each exhale carrying the smell of promethium and antiseptic, and yet beneath the machine, something human tried to surface. Something that wanted to scream. The attendants recoiled, their practiced efficiency faltering for a heartbeat. Even the servitors paused, their jointed limbs frozen as if recognizing the anomaly in their protocols. The creature, or the man, shuffled forward, dragging one leg with a scraping rhythm that echoed across the canvas floor. Its right arm ended in a mechanical claw, crudely soldered where the flesh had failed. And yet it moved with a strange, desperate grace, like a dancer trapped in gears. Jalen's breath hitched beside me. "They?" he whispered, too stunned to finish. His eyes followed the uneven steps, the way the flap had become a threshold not just between rooms, but between life as we knew it and some perverse mimicry of survival. "They don't even call these men guards anymore. Not in the wards. Not in the whispers." He looked away, as if the sight alone was a sin. The Medicae chirurgeon recovered first. Her hands moved rapidly over a stim injector. Her voice clipped, "Do not interfere. Move back." She stepped between the thing and the inner triage, a wall of human authority against the grotesque semblance of a man. "Critical containment," she said, almost to herself, as if uttering it aloud made it real. I wanted to turn my eyes, to run my thoughts elsewhere, but the tent had contracted into that single motion, the scraping of one broken body toward us, a warning and a promise. The air thickened, heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that survival in this place had a cost no one volunteered to name. The flap settled back, leaving us with nothing but the echo of gurgling breath and the metallic scrape against the floor, an imprint on our senses that would not fade. The attendants resumed their tasks, but the rhythm had changed. Hands moved faster, voices clipped sharper. Every incision, every medicated touch, every stretcher that wheeled past carried a heightened urgency, a recognition that nothing here was sacred except the calculation of who could be saved and who could be transformed. I shifted on my cot, wincing as the pain flared, and tried to process it. This was no battlefield casualty. Not entirely. The thing we had just glimpsed was a warning, a fragment of the machinery that had consumed so many of us already. Its presence was a whisper from the depths of the Apothecarion. Survival here was conditional, transactional, and often incomplete. Jalen lay beside me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "They call it the threshold," he said finally, voice hushed. "A place where the wounded pass through. Some come out whole. Some come back changed. And some never leave at all." His fingers trembled as they brushed against the edge of the cot. "If you survive, you learn to pretend that you didn't see anything. You learn that life is just the next calculation." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the sound of a distant explosion punctuated my silence. The tent shook. Supplies rattled. A fresh batch of wounded was brought in, carried over the splintered boards of the walkway, screaming and whispering in the same breath. Medicae hands snatched at them with surgical efficiency, weighing their value in heartbeats and usable limbs. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the fear, a small spark remained. Awareness. Consciousness. We were alive. Not by chance, but by the cold determination of those who measured life like a resource. And that awareness was sharper than any pain, brighter than the flash of lost fire outside, and heavier than the blood that soaked the mud outside these walls. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat. When I opened them again, the inner triage line had resumed its rhythm, the creatures of survival and machinery intertwining in a ballet of purpose and horror. The wounded groaned, the Medicae murmured, the servitors clanked, and outside, the distant artillery never ceased. Somewhere beneath it all, I felt the first stirrings of understanding. To be wounded in the Imperium was not merely to suffer. It was to enter a system that demanded payment in body, in sanity, and in the fragments of self one could still salvage. The line between survival and sacrifice was thinner than a servitor's claw. And we had already crossed it. The hum of the transport engines faded in memory, replaced by the low, steady pulse of life measured in breaths, groans, and liturgical mumblings. And in that pulse, the battlefield lingered, not as a place, but as a weight, a promise that nothing here was ever truly over. The Apothecarion was a cathedral of precision disguised as a hospital. Its walls, forged from corroded iron and polished ceramite, exhaled a cold metallic breath that carried the faint tang of chemicals and ancient rituals. The corridors were narrow, deliberately so, guiding every step with the efficiency of a cog in the vast machine of the Imperium. A distant hum, almost reverent in its constancy, resonated from the sublevels, power conduits, ventilators, and machinery designed to sustain the wounded, the dying, and the barely human. The air was thicker here, suffused with the scent of antiseptic, promethium vapor, and something darker, something that spoke of long nights spent observing men as they slipped between life and functional utility. I was brought through a sliding bulkhead into the main ward, supported on a stretcher by two medici attendants who moved as though their boots never touched the floor. The lighting was clinical, harsh, and unrelenting. Every face I passed was a study in despair or calculation, patients, medici, and attendants alike. Some wore expressions of faith, others of terror, and many carried both at once. The wounded had been filtered here from the front lines, sorted not just by injury but by the potential the Imperium saw in them. Not all who arrived would leave. I was lowered onto a steel table, cold and unforgiving. The servitors at my side began their work without instruction. Some monitored vitals, their clawed hands adjusting stimulators. Others prepared surgical tools, their movements precise but devoid of human tenderness. One moved closer, scanning my torso with a luminescent auspex that painted my wounds in shades of red and blue. Every flicker of the scanner was a verdict, a judgment rendered in real time. The chirurgeon approached, her robe a cascade of white and crimson streaked with antiseptic stains. Her helm lenses glowed softly, illuminating the edges of her features that would otherwise be unreadable beneath the mask. She didn't smile. She didn't speak more than necessary. Here, emotion was irrelevant. Survival and restoration were quantified, measured, and executed with almost sacred devotion. "You've lost a significant amount of blood," she said, her voice modulated through the voxcaster. "We will stabilize you, but consciousness must be preserved. Otherwise, you will be a liability." A liability. I had heard the word before in passing, but never so sharply directed at my own body. Survival was not an act of divine favor. It was a calculation, a ledger entry made in the names of efficiency and usefulness. The table beneath me vibrated slightly as the servitors worked, their movements synchronized, a mechanical ballet of precision and cold judgment. One extended a mechadendrite toward my wound, delicately feeding stimulators beneath torn flesh. Another adjusted the flow of coagulant, regulating it with the patience of centuries embedded in machine memory. The hum of the machinery was steady, relentless, and hypnotic, a reminder that life here was maintained not by miracles, but by protocols written in fear and discipline. I watched the attendants moving between patients, each decision immediate, each gesture calculated. A man with a shattered arm was guided onto a surgical platform. The sound of bone grinding under mechanized hands echoed like a percussion of inevitability. A guardsman with burns across his torso screamed, but the chirurgeon merely adjusted his stimulators, her eyes flicking to read the vital signs and nothing more. Pain was irrelevant. Pain was currency. Through the lens of the auspex, I could see the system's design. Every pulse, every breath, every flicker of consciousness was logged, evaluated. Decisions were made in microseconds. Who would be sewn back together, who would be repurposed, who would be removed. Rumors whispered among the attendants spoke of those who never left the inner chambers, of bodies transformed into servitors or augmented beyond recognition, but no one dared confirm. In the Imperium, such knowledge was as dangerous as the weapons at the front. Jalen had been placed on the cot beside me. His face was pale, sweat clinging to his brow, eyes darting nervously between the attendants and the machinery. "Do they always work like this?" he whispered. "They always work like this," I said. "You just don't see it when the smoke is still rising outside." He shivered, drawing the thin hospital blanket closer. The faint smell of burning promethium and blood still lingered, drifting through the air vents like a reminder that the Apothecarion existed only because the battlefield did. Here, survival was literal, surgical, and mercilessly exacting. And as I lay beneath the scanning auspex, feeling the cold bite of mechanical tools and antiseptic mist, I realized that no matter how carefully they measured it, life here was not guaranteed. It was earned, bit by bit, by the slow, deliberate attention of those who had learned to treat flesh as a resource and faith as a protocol. Outside, the distant artillery continued its rhythm, a heartbeat of war that seeped through walls and floors, reminding all of us that the front line was never far, and that even in the calculated sanctum of the Apothecarion, the battlefield had not ended. The inner chambers of the Apothecarion were quieter, but the quiet was heavy, saturated with the weight of suffering and calculation. The walls, reinforced with ceramite and lined with conduits, seemed to hum with the accumulated energy of centuries spent preserving the bodies of the Imperium. Servitors moved like shadows, their mechanical limbs precise, unyielding, and completely indifferent. Each motion carried the promise of survival, or the quiet threat of transformation. I was shifted onto another table deeper in the chamber, where the air was colder, denser, and almost tactile with the presence of the critically wounded. The lumens overhead flickered in soft, sterile pulses, casting elongated shadows across the faces of soldiers whose eyes were hollowed by fatigue, pain, and the faint recognition that they had become components in a system that treated their bodies like machines. Jalen lay beside me, shivering against the cold, his breathing shallow but steady. A chirurgeon stepped forward, her robes trailing lightly on the polished floor. Her fingers moved over my torso, testing, adjusting, calculating. "The wound will close," she said in clipped tones, her eyes hidden behind glowing lenses that measured every tremor of muscle and pulse of blood. "But consciousness must be maintained. Otherwise," her voice trailed, and I knew the unspoken words, "otherwise, I would become one of the statistics no one recorded in the open logs." A servitor extended a mechadendrite toward me, its claws delicate and precise. It manipulated my wound with the precision of centuries of mechanical memory, feeding coagulants and stimulators directly into torn tissue. Each movement was controlled, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, a cold ballet of purpose and preservation. I could feel the warmth returning slowly to my limbs, the pulse of blood cautiously restored, as if the machine itself had learned patience from the endless cycles of war and healing. The sounds around me were a mixture of human and mechanical, a symphony of survival. A guardsman screamed across the room as his arm was rebuilt with stimulators and grafted tissue. The chirurgeon overseeing him gave no comfort, only efficiency. Nearby, a half-melted servitor whined softly, tending to a different patient with meticulous, inhuman precision. The hum of machinery underlaid everything, steady and unyielding, like the heartbeat of a world that refused to end. Jalen leaned closer, voice a whisper. "Do they ever make mistakes?" I didn't answer immediately. The question lingered in the air, heavy and dangerous. The Imperium allowed no room for error, at least not for those who lay under the hands of the Apothecarion. Yet the whispers persisted, carried by attendants who moved too quickly, too carefully, to risk uttering them aloud. They spoke of bodies transformed into servitors without warning, of men who awoke with more metal than flesh, of prayers that were answered only in the quiet submission of consciousness to necessity. A sudden clatter drew my attention. A stretcher had been rolled in from a side corridor, carrying a soldier whose chest had been torn open, ribs shattered, organs exposed. The Medici team descended immediately, hands moving with cold coordination. I could see the terror in the soldier's eyes, reflected in the metallic glint of instruments, but the team did not flinch. Life here was measured in moments and potential. If the system deemed you too damaged to remain human, it would remake you into something else, functional, compliant, and uncomplaining. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, dense with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and machinery. My own breathing was shallow, measured, forced into rhythm by the presence of servitors and the quiet hum of the inner chambers. Jalen's hand brushed against mine, a fleeting, human gesture in the midst of mechanical precision. He did not speak. His eyes reflected the terror and fascination I felt myself. We were both witnesses to a system that preserved life without sentiment, a sanctum where pain was catalogued, where flesh was treated as data, and where survival was never guaranteed, only calculated. The chirurgeon leaned closer to me, her voice low and mechanical. "You will survive if you allow the system to complete its work." There was no warmth in the words, no comfort, only fact. Life here was a ledger, a balance sheet of injuries versus resources, and I was merely an entry on a page written in blood and oil. Outside, the distant artillery continued its relentless rhythm, a pulse of war that penetrated walls and floors alike. Even here, in the carefully controlled sanctum of the Apothecarion, the battlefield's presence lingered. Every groan, every hiss of a mechadendrite, every whisper of prayer was a reminder that the war was unending, that survival carried a cost beyond comprehension, and that the wounded were not merely victims. They were components in a vast machine whose only law was efficiency. Time in the inner chambers was measured in the rhythm of machines and the faint, uneasy breaths of the wounded. Every movement was precise, every decision a calculation, and every human life an entry in a ledger the Imperium kept with ruthless efficiency. I had long since stopped thinking of myself as merely injured. Here, I was an equation, a set of variables the Medici would manipulate until the output, life, function, survival, was within acceptable parameters. The servitors moved like shadows along the edges of the ward, their polished metal limbs reflecting the flickering lumens in sharp, unnatural glints. One paused near my head, the thin whine of a mechadendrite filling the silence. Its appendage hovered for a moment before delicately adjusting a stim injector beneath my chest plate, the precision unnerving. It did not hesitate, it did not consider, and it certainly did not feel. Yet in that absence of hesitation, there was a kind of cold grace, a ritual of preservation, stripped of mercy and sentiment. Jalen had been placed on the adjacent cot. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into some distance only he could perceive. "Do you ever wonder," he whispered, "if they see us as people at all? Or just pieces?" His voice trembled, but his lips formed the words with deliberate care, as if speaking aloud would prevent the thought from being swallowed by the inner machinery. I did not answer. The question had no answer here. The chirurgeons moved past us, hands precise, faces impassive behind their helmets. One reached for a soldier whose leg had been shattered beyond recognition. A soft hiss of stim injectors was followed by the grinding of bone stabilizers, and the soldier's scream fractured the air. No one flinched. The servitors adjusted their grips, recording every movement in silent, indifferent obedience. Above us, the lumen strips flickered in irregular patterns, their harsh light casting shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. It was easy to forget that the Apothecarion existed within a city that still burned, within a universe that had never ceased its consumption of life. Outside, the distant roar of artillery and engines punctuated the mechanical hum of the inner wards, reminding us that the battlefield was always present, even when filtered through layers of steel, ceramite, and antiseptic air. A sudden alarm cut through the quiet rhythm. A red beam swept across the ward, and Medicae assistants scrambled, adjusting vitals, reassigning priorities, calculating anew. Someone had arrived in critical condition, brought in by stretcher from the outer triage line. The attendants moved with orchestrated speed, their hands and voices synchronized with servitor movements. Every second here was measured in survival potential, every gesture a decision about who would live and who would be repurposed. Jalen's hand found mine again, tighter this time, as if holding onto the small remnant of humanity we shared. "I've heard stories," he whispered, barely audible over the hum of machinery, "of men who don't make it out the same. Their bodies, their minds. The system doesn't just heal them. It changes them. And sometimes it doesn't give them a choice." The words settled over me like a shadow. Rumor, perhaps. But in this place, rumor was indistinguishable from observation. The thing we had glimpsed in the inner ward, the half-man, half-machine, was proof that survival in the Imperium was never absolute. It was conditional, mutable, and often irreversible. The chirurgeon returned, her lenses glowing a steady blue as she scanned the newly arrived patient. "Stabilize first. Preserve consciousness. Determine expendable matter." Her words, precise and stripped of emotion, reinforced the calculus of existence that governed every chamber of the Apothecarion. Here, life was a resource. Here, survival was not mercy, it was management. As I lay back against the steel table, feeling the stimulator's pulse beneath my flesh, I understood something vital. The wounded were not merely saved, they were measured, reshaped, and catalogued. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every intake of breath was recorded, assessed, and directed toward a singular outcome. The Imperium needed functional soldiers, not men. And in this realization, the line between life and machinery blurred. Outside, artillery continued its relentless rhythm, a reminder that the front line never truly ended. Inside, the Apothecarion's machinery carried on, indifferent to cries, to prayers, to fear. And somewhere deep within its corridors, beyond the reach of human eyes, the most critical cases were being addressed. Bodies and minds remade in ways that were whispered about but rarely seen. Here, survival had a price. And it was measured not in mercy, but in calculation. The deeper chambers of the Apothecarion felt like another universe entirely. The air grew colder, heavier, each inhalation a reminder that nothing here existed outside the logic of survival. The lumens flickered unevenly, casting long, distorted shadows across walls lined with machinery that seemed almost organic in their complexity. Here, the wounded were no longer simply patients. They were variables in a system designed to preserve, repurpose, or erase, depending on what the Imperium demanded. I was moved further along the corridor by servitors, their mechanical limbs carrying me with unerring precision. Each step echoed against the ceramite floors like the heartbeat of a machine. Along the walls, I glimpsed others, figures lying on slabs, restrained, their forms partially augmented or supported by wires and stimulators. Some had lost limbs, others parts of their faces, yet they remained alive, eyes flickering with dim awareness, a fragment of the person they had been before the battlefield. Jalen was beside me, his gaze fixed ahead, his body tense against the cot. "This is where they decide," he whispered. "Who returns whole, who comes back altered, and who never leaves." His voice trembled, but there was a grim acceptance in it. I wanted to argue, to say it couldn't be so, but the chamber itself offered proof with every subtle whir of machinery, every hiss of injectors, every muted scream that rose from the slabs ahead. A chirurgeon moved among the patients, her hands precise, her attention unwavering. She was both sculptor and executioner, shaping survival with calculated strokes. A young guardsman screamed as stimulators coursed through his body, his fingers twitching involuntarily. She adjusted the flow without pause, recording every reaction, her lenses capturing data the human mind could scarcely comprehend. Each patient was a project, each movement a measurement. I felt a strange, creeping weight in my chest as I realized the full scale of what this place represented. The Apothecarion did not heal indiscriminately. It did not comfort. It measured, repaired, and modified, sometimes leaving the body human, sometimes leaving it something else entirely. Rumors whispered among the attendants suggested that men were turned into servitors here, or given enhancements without consent, their identities gradually stripped away until only functionality remained. I shivered, tracing the lines of pain and machinery that surrounded us, wondering if I would emerge whole, or merely useful. Jalen leaned closer, eyes wide. "Do you feel it?" he asked, voice low. "The system watching. Not the medici. Not the attendants. The system itself. Every pulse, every breath, recorded, measured, judged. I did. Every flicker of the lumens, every hiss of an injector, every soft whine of a servitor joint felt like part of an unseen consciousness. Cold, impartial, absolute. Here, in the deepest chambers, survival was a transaction with a force older and more relentless than any human hand. The wounded were not saved, they were processed. A sudden shift of movement drew my eyes. At the far end of the chamber, beyond a thick steel partition, a figure stirred. At first, I thought it was another patient. Then I saw the partial augmentations, metal fused to flesh, eyes glowing with an unnatural light, limbs moving in ways human anatomy should not allow. It paused, head tilting as if observing. Then it vanished into the shadows. The presence left a chill in the room, unspoken but undeniable. Jalen's fingers tightened on the edge of the cot. "Some of them never return the same," he whispered. "Some never return at all." The chirurgeon moved to my side, adjusting stimulators and clamps, her voice clipped, precise. "Vitals are stabilizing. Consciousness preserved. Efficiency within acceptable parameters." Her words were not reassurance. They were a verdict. I was counted as functional. That was all. The distant thrum of artillery and the occasional boom of macro cannons reminded us that the war beyond these walls was unending. Within, the machinery hummed, indifferent to prayer or scream, indifferent to doubt or fear. In the Apothecarion, life was preserved, altered, and measured with clinical devotion. The wounded emerged not merely healed, but catalogued, transformed, and conditioned to survive, not as men, but as instruments of the Imperium. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the pulse of machinery through the table beneath me. Here, survival was not a blessing. It was a transaction, a negotiation with protocols older than memory. And in this cold, humming sanctum, I realized that to endure was not enough. To endure meant submission to the calculation of life itself. The hum of servitors and the soft hiss of stimulators created a rhythm that I would carry with me long after I left this chamber, a pulse that would haunt every battlefield to come. The threshold was not marked by signs, doors, or banners. It existed instead as a change in the air, a subtle tightening in the chest, a whisper at the edge of consciousness that reminded every soldier, every patient, that survival was no longer simple. Beyond this invisible line, the wounded ceased to be merely human. They were components in a system that weighed, measured, and manipulated every heartbeat and nerve impulse with clinical, merciless precision. I was wheeled forward on a stretcher, the hum of servitors vibrating beneath me, the metallic scent of promethium thick in the air. The walls here were darker, lined with panels of polished ceramite that reflected distorted images of those who passed, a constant reminder that reflection was never idle. Each step brought us closer to the chambers that had birthed whispers among the triage attendants. Whispers of men returned altered, hollowed, or no longer entirely themselves. Jalen lay beside me, pale and trembling. "Do you hear it?" he whispered, voice barely audible over the soft hum of machinery. "The threshold has a sound. Not loud, but insistent, like the heartbeat of the building itself." I strained to listen. There was indeed a pulse, subtle but insistent, beneath the low whine of servitors and the hiss of stimulators. It was not human. Not entirely. It was the rhythm of calculation, the measured cadence of survival being rewritten with each breath and twitch of muscle. A Medicae attendant stepped forward, adjusting clamps on my torso with hands that were steady, almost inhuman in their precision. "Vitals stable. Threshold approach imminent," she said, not a question, not a reassurance, just fact. The words hung in the air like a promise I was not sure I wanted to keep. The inner chamber opened into a wide hall, lit by harsh lumens that glared like twin suns. Tables lined the floor in rows, each occupied by a soldier in various states of recovery, or transformation. Servitors moved between them, adjusting stim injectors, monitoring vitals, recording data in silent precision. Some soldiers lay still, eyes closed, hands twitching. Others were already upright, walking with mechanical assistance, their movements unnatural, precise, almost puppet-like. One figure caught my attention immediately. A man, or something that had once been a man, stood near the far wall. His flesh was pocked with surgical scarring, a mechanical limb fused at the shoulder, eyes glowing faintly behind ocular implants. He moved with deliberate, unsettling grace, stepping through the ward as if guided by some internal metronome. A nurse whispered a prayer and looked away. The Medicae did not react. They had already recorded him, measured him, and assigned him a value. Jalen shivered beside me. "They come back like that sometimes," he whispered. "The ones who survive the threshold. But it's not them. Not really." I swallowed hard. The thought pressed in, suffocating in its inevitability. To survive here was not merely to heal. It was to be recalibrated, measured against the demands of the Imperium, and remade in its cold image. Rumor suggested that some never regained full humanity, that their minds were fragmented, their memories catalogued and overwritten, their wills subordinated to the machinery that had saved their flesh. The attendant's mechadendrite brushed against my side, adjusting stimulators with gentle, mechanical precision. "Threshold protocols engaged," it said, voice flat, monotone, unyielding. There was no question in its tone, no compassion. The threshold did not negotiate. It did not delay. It acted. The stretcher shuddered as it was moved forward, each vibration a reminder of the weight of expectation pressing down. My breathing grew shallow, each inhale forced, deliberate. Outside, the muted roar of distant artillery threaded through the walls, a reminder that this chamber, this sanctum of calculated survival, existed only because war demanded it. And within these walls, survival was a measurement, a ledger entry, a transaction with protocols older than any memory of man. Jalen squeezed my hand, a fleeting human anchor amidst the mechanical precision. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "hold on to yourself. Don't let them take more than they already have." His eyes met mine, full of fear, hope, and resignation all at once. I nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. The threshold awaited, patient, indifferent, absolute. And as the servitors carried us deeper into the inner sanctum, I understood, with a clarity I could not deny, that what awaited beyond this line would determine not just survival, but the very nature of who, or what, we would become. The inner sanctum of the threshold was a cathedral of control, every inch of its polished ceramite and steel humming with a cold, unyielding authority. The lumens overhead glared down like twin suns, washing the room in harsh, unflinching light. Servitors moved between the tables and cots, limbs glinting, fingers adjusting stimulators and clamps with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. Here, no one hesitated. Every gesture was measured, every action deliberate, and every heartbeat accounted for. I was lowered onto a new platform, the surface smooth and cold beneath me. The attendants circled with mechanical efficiency, their hands steady, lenses glowing faintly as they scanned, assessed, and recorded. The pulse of the machinery merged with my own heartbeat, creating a rhythm that was disorienting, intimate, and profoundly alien all at once. Jalen lay on the adjacent platform, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his breathing shallow. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, almost afraid his words would be heard. "The threshold, it watches. Not the attendants, not the medici. The system itself. It measures us." I nodded, though the thought sent a chill down my spine. Every flicker of lumens, every hiss of an injector, every hum of servitor joints seemed to pulse with awareness, like the building itself had become a sentient arbiter of life and function. Survival here was not granted. It was assessed, rationed, and enforced. A chirurgeon moved beside me, adjusting stimulators with a surgeon's detachment. Vitals within expected parameters. "Consciousness stable," she said, voice clipped, almost ceremonial. There was no warmth in her words, no comfort, only fact. I understood then that in this chamber, to be human was irrelevant. What mattered was utility. What mattered was function. The threshold revealed its cruel impartiality in subtle ways. Soldiers who had once screamed now lay quiet, their bodies reacting only to stim injections and mechadendrite manipulation. Some moved with unnatural precision, augmented or retrained, their eyes vacant yet focused, as if guided by invisible gears. Others trembled, their minds flickering between memory and protocol, a liminal state where fear and pain were catalogued and quantified rather than felt. Jalen's voice came again, low and tremulous. "I've seen men emerge from here with more machine than flesh. And some, they don't come back at all. Their minds, broken into fragments. Stored, measured, then discarded." He swallowed, trying to steady his breathing. "They say it's mercy. But it's not mercy. It's calculation." I watched as a servitor approached a soldier on the far platform. The man's chest had been shattered, ribs crushed, yet the mechadendrite worked with delicate precision, weaving stimulators and grafted tissue in a methodical pattern. The soldier twitched, screamed, and then gradually quieted. Survival had been imposed upon him with cold efficiency, a resurrection governed by protocols, not compassion. A sudden shift caught my attention. At the far end of the chamber, partially obscured by shadows, a figure stirred, a survivor of the inner threshold. Its limbs were augmented, its motions precise, but the eyes flickered with recognition, or perhaps with a fragment of what it had once been. The presence was unsettling, a reminder that the threshold did not heal equally. It reshaped, repurposed, and redefined life. I could feel Jalen's hand trembling as it brushed against mine. "Remember," he whispered, "whatever you do, hold on to yourself. Don't let them decide who you are entirely." His words were a fragile anchor in a chamber that had already stripped so many of identity, of humanity, of autonomy. The hum of machinery, the hiss of stimulators, and the soft whine of servitors created a rhythm that seemed alive, calculating every twitch, every pulse, every reaction. Outside, the distant artillery continued, a reminder that the war never paused, that even this sanctum existed only because the Imperium demanded it. And in that rhythm, I understood the stark truth of the threshold. It was not merely a place of healing. It was a crucible, a reckoning, a negotiation with life itself. Every movement, every breath, every measured response was an answer to its silent, absolute inquiry. Who would survive, and at what cost? I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the subtle pressure of mechanical arms, stimulators pulsing beneath my flesh, and the unmistakable weight of calculation pressing against every thought. Survival was no longer enough. To endure was to submit to a system that would measure, define, and, if necessary, remake me entirely. The threshold pressed closer with every second, its presence more palpable than the air, more insistent than the hum of servitors. Every movement around me was deliberate, measured, precise. The wounded lay on tables and slabs in varying states of repair, augmentation, and suspension. Some twitched involuntarily under the influence of stimulators, their limbs jerking like puppets to a rhythm only the machines understood. Others sat upright, guided by mechanical limbs or implanted braces, moving with a grace that was alien yet efficient, unnatural yet functional. Jalen's breathing hitched beside me. He stared at the far end of the chamber, where the innermost ward began, an area reserved for those deemed critical, where life was preserved through methods whispered about in rumor, feared in practice. "Do you see them?" he asked, voice barely audible. "The ones who have crossed entirely?" I followed his gaze. Beyond a set of reinforced ceramite doors, shadows moved. Shapes with glowing ocular implants, with limbs grafted from metal and ceramite, moved with a precision that no human could naturally achieve. There was something in their posture, the tilt of a head, the subtle rhythm of a limb, that spoke not of freedom but of imposed order, a subjugation of body to system, mind to function. The attendant's mechadendrite brushed against my side, adjusting stimulators, applying coagulants with a precision that made the process feel more surgical than compassionate. "Threshold engagement complete in 60 seconds, the monotone voice intoned. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold bite of metal against flesh, the gentle pressure that threatened to erase me into mere data points. Jalen's hand sought mine again. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember who you are. Don't let them overwrite you." His words were a fragile lifeline. I clutched his hand, feeling the tremor beneath the skin, a reminder that amidst the machinery, some semblance of humanity remained. The chirurgeon moved between the slabs, lenses glowing faintly, hands precise and unhesitating. A soldier screamed as stimulators coursed through his chest, mechanical grafts aligning shattered bone and sinew. The medici recorded, observed, catalogued. Every pulse, every convulsion, every flicker of consciousness was logged. There was no mercy here. Only survival, measured in units of utility. At the far end of the ward, a figure stirred. A man, or what had once been a man, whose flesh was marred by surgery and augmentation. He rose slowly, mechanical joints whirring, eyes flickering with a trace of recognition. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were performing a ritual of function dictated by the threshold itself. The whispers I had heard in triage were confirmed here. Survival could mean transformation, identity could be fragmented, and humanity could be sacrificed to the machine of war. Jalen's voice was a quiet tremor beside me. Some of them never come back fully. They survive, yes, but not as themselves. And the worst, the ones who are too damaged, too broken, they vanish. Into the system. Into the depths. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the edge of the cot. And no one ever speaks of them. The realization pressed down like a weight. To survive the threshold was to negotiate with forces that measured not your courage, not your valor, but your utility. To endure was to submit to a process that might alter every aspect of body and mind, leaving only the echo of the person you once were. The hum of servitors, the hiss of stimulators, and the soft clatter of instruments created a rhythm, steady and relentless. It was a rhythm that would haunt every battlefield, every triage ward, every whispered story of survival from this point onward. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my consciousness, reminding me that the threshold was absolute, and that life within its walls was not granted. It was measured, enforced, and sometimes taken entirely. As the Medici adjusted my stimulators one last time, I realized that the threshold was not a place one merely crossed. It was a judgment, a crucible, a silent observer of who we were, who we might become, and what the Imperium required of us to remain alive. And in that realization, I understood, survival here was not mercy. It was calculation. And in the cold humming depths of the inner Apothecarion, that calculation was absolute. The final stretch of the threshold was quieter, yet heavier than anything I had experienced. The air pressed against my lungs with a cold insistence, scented with antiseptic oil and the faint tang of burnt promethium from distant artillery. Every step carried a weight, every breath was measured, and every pulse was noted by eyes that were not human and minds that cared only for function. Jalen's hand remained tightly in mine. His eyes darted across the room, watching soldiers lying on slabs, half rebuilt, half transformed, and others moving with mechanical precision, their augmentations subtle but undeniable. "It's the last part," he whispered. "The point of no return. After this, the system decides who walks out human, and who doesn't." His words trembled, yet they were grounded in the same grim understanding we both shared. Nothing here was chance. A chirurgeon approached, lenses glowing faintly, hands steady, precise. She did not speak. Words were unnecessary in the final chamber. Her mechadendrites extended toward me, adjusting stimulators and scanning my vitals with surgical indifference. The subtle pressure on my body was almost hypnotic, guiding me toward the final measurement. I could feel every microcorrection, every pulse of energy, every adjustment of blood flow, as if the threshold itself were reshaping me, preparing me for the verdict to come. From the far end of the chamber, I caught sight of figures who had already emerged. Augmented soldiers walking with uncanny poise, their eyes glowing with implanted oculars, limbs moving with deliberate mechanical rhythm. Some bore scars that had been grafted over with metal, others carried augmentations that hinted at replacements rather than repairs. They were alive, but they were not wholly themselves. And in their presence, the cost of survival became undeniable. Jalen's voice broke the mechanical rhythm, barely above a whisper. "Whatever you do, don't let them take more than they have to. Remember who you are." His fingers tightened around mine. I nodded, though the movement felt small against the weight of inevitability pressing down. The chirurgeon's mechadendrite brushed across my chest one last time. Vitals stable. Threshold process complete. Consciousness preserved. Functional parameters acceptable. The words were stark, absolute. They were not a reassurance. They were a verdict. I was counted as one of the living, one of the functional. But the whisper of what had been lost, or what might yet be lost, lingered like a shadow across my mind. The servitors moved away, leaving me lying on the cold platform. The faint hum of machinery filled the room, mingling with the distant roar of artillery and the occasional cry of the wounded. I felt Jalen's hand press against mine once more, grounding me, reminding me that some fragment of humanity persisted even amidst the cold calculus of the threshold. I rose slowly, limbs stiff from the stimulators and the prolonged pressure of mechanical guidance. Around me, soldiers, some whole, some partially augmented, moved in choreographed precision, a testament to the Imperium's relentless insistence that life, no matter how wounded, had a purpose. Survival had been imposed, not granted. Humanity had been measured, quantified, and preserved where the system allowed. Stepping toward the exit, I glanced once more at the inner chambers of the Apothecarion. The faint shadows of the threshold lingered in my vision, a reminder that every wound carried a cost, every life a transaction, and every survival a silent bargain with forces far older and far colder than the men who walked these halls. And yet, amidst the humming machinery and the whispering ghosts of those who had crossed before us, I realized something vital. Even within the system's relentless calculus, even beneath the cold steel of servitors and stimulators, some fragment of self remained. Survival was never complete, but it was enough to carry forward, step by measured step, into a world that demanded more than courage, more than blood. It demanded compliance, calculation, and above all, endurance. The threshold had not merely healed us. It had transformed us. And as Jalen and I emerged from the inner chambers into the dimmer corridors beyond, I understood, with stark clarity, that to survive the Imperium was not mercy. It was judgment. It was obligation. And it was a price we would carry with us long after the battlefield faded from view.